Olá, boa noite a todos. Eu sou Marcelo Cabral, o apresentador da Entre Mundus, que é o canal de entrevistas da nossa revista Unus Mundus, a revista digital da Academia ABC2. Já faz mais de um ano que nós lançamos a revista Unus Mundus. Se você não conhece, coloca aí no Google Unus Mundus para conhecer a nossa revista digital, seu tablet, celular, no seu computador. É uma revista que tem investigado grandes questões na interação entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia. E nesses últimos meses, nesses últimos anos, nós temos publicado ensaios, artigos, colunas, podcasts, diversas mídias com diferentes tons, mas todas elas buscando abordar essas diversas questões que surgem na interação entre a fé, as ciências e a filosofia. São questões inerentemente difíceis, desafiadoras, mas talvez sejam as questões mais importantes da nossa existência. E entre essas várias mídias que compõem a Unus Mundus, nós temos este canal de entrevistas, o Entre Mundus, no qual nós recebemos grandes autores, grandes pensadores, pessoas que têm contribuído de forma substancial para o diálogo da fé e das ciências. E hoje a gente tem um convidado muito especial para conversar sobre, sem dúvida, um dos temas mais fundamentais do nosso tempo, que é a relação nossa com o trabalho e tudo que a gente pode pensar a partir de questões teológicas e filosóficas dessa relação do humano com o seu trabalho. Então, deixa eu aqui apresentar para vocês quem que vai participar dessa conversa hoje. Como entrevistadores, nós teremos a Cynthia Muniz, que é bióloga e mestre em saúde pública pela USP. Também é teóloga formada pela Faculdade Teológica Sul-Americana, é especialista em teologia do Novo Testamento e mestranda em estudos bíblicos e teológicos do Novo Testamento pelo seminário Jonathan Edwards. Ela atua na equipe pastoral da Igreja Anglicana Porto, em São Paulo, além de ser palestrante, professora e podcaster. Cynthia, muito bem-vinda.
Obrigado. Agradeço.
Muito bem. Também, como entrevistador, nós teremos o meu querido amigo Ednardo, que é doutorando em teologia pública pelo Fuller Theological Seminary. Ele possui mestrado pela EST e bacharelado em teologia. É especialista em gestão de pessoas pela FGV e coordena o Seminário Teológico de Gramado e o Centro Global de Educação Transformacional Teach Beyond. Ed, muito obrigado por estar com a gente hoje.
Eu que agradeço. Boa noite, gente.
Muito bom. Por fim, como entrevistador também, nós temos prata da casa, o Tiago Melo, que é graduado em Teologia, é mestre em Ciências da Religião pela PUC Campinas e doutorando em Ciências da Religião pela Universidade Metodista de São Paulo e pela Universidade Livre de Amsterdã. Atua como editor assistente na Academia ABC2. Tamo junto, né, Tiagão? E é fellow do programa Life Worth Living. Olha que chique, né? Life Worth Living, do Yale Center for Faith and Culture. E por fim, pessoal, né, nós temos aqui como o nosso convidado especial de hoje, o Matthew Kaemingk, que é especialista em ética cristã e teólogo público. Ele tem doutorado teologia sistemática pela Universidade Livre de Amsterdã e em ética cristã pelo Fuller Theological Seminary. Ele atua como professor da cadeira Richard John Moe de Fé e Vida Pública no Fuller, e ele é orientando do Ed, por sinal, é isso, né, Ed? Esse é orientador.
Isso aí.
Também ele dirige o Moe Institute of Faith and Public Life. Atua como pesquisador no Center for Public Justice em Washington, capital dos Estados Unidos, e é acadêmico residente no The Prey Center for Christian Leadership. É autor e editor de vários livros, incluindo Christian Hospitality and Muslim Immigration, né, Hospitalidade Cristã e Migração Muçulmana, e também o livro Work and Worship, com Corey Wilson, que foi meu professor no Calvin Theological Seminary. ele organizou o livro Reformed Public Theology, publicado no Brasil ano passado pela Nelson Brasil, com o título, olha lá, esse aí, Teologia Pública Reformada, uma visão abrangente pela vida. E foi também homenageado com o prestigioso prêmio Intellectual Public, desculpa estar em português aqui, mas Intelectual Público Emergente do Ano, em 2019. Queridos que estão nos vendo ao vivo, agora eu vou virar uma chavinha aqui para o inglês, para continuar nossa conversa, ok? Se você está vendo ao vivo, lembra que quando isso for publicado, você vai ter aí legendas para poder acompanhar e compartilhar esse vídeo com todo mundo, que a conversa com certeza vai ser demais. Então vamos lá? Dr. Matthew, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a big honor for us to have you here this night.
It is wonderful to be with you. It is an honor to be with you. I could not understand your introduction, but I trust that you said nice things about me. So thank you very much for your hospitality. I have grown to love the Church of Brazil very much in the last few years. I'm very excited about the theological conversations that are happening there. And so I'm looking forward to this evening and for more conversations in the future.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. So let's start our conversation. And as I am the host, I have the privilege of the first question. So please, Dr. Matthew, this is probably our most philosophical question. The question is, who are you? Oh, so tell us a little bit about what do you do, about your personal journey. How did you arrive? Where are you today in terms of your career, in terms of your journey of faith, or whatever you think is relevant for us?
Yes, well, that is a very big question. I will try to stay focused. When I was a student in university, I was studying politics and law, and I was very interested in political philosophy. And I went to a Christian university, and many of the Christians there were on the political left, and then there were many Christians there who were on the political right. And both of them believed that God was on their side. Both of them believed that if Jesus were here, he would be on the left or he would be on the right. And I did not find either side compelling. I felt like they were using their faith to fund their particular political perspectives. They had a political agenda, and they wanted Jesus to help them with that. And I found that very frustrating and disrespectful. And so at a very young age, I was asking a lot of questions about how to be faithful in public life. And I was also thinking about being a lawyer. I was thinking about going to law school. And my grandmother said to me, no, you cannot go to law school. You cannot become a lawyer because you will lose your faith. You will become a dirty lawyer. You will become greedy and worldly, and you should become a pastor or you should become a missionary. And so that made me ask a lot of questions about faith and the workplace and faith in public life, and what does it mean to be strangely Christian in a secular place. So I grew up in a city called Seattle in the northwest of America, which does not have very many Christians at all. So only 5% of my city goes to church. So following Jesus is a very strange thing there. So I've always been asking questions about faith and politics, about faith and the workplace, and about faith in secular society. Now, if you were asking about my personal life, my wife and I have been married for 20 years, and we have 3 boys. They are young, and they are very loud, and they are very messy, but we still love them. So
that's amazing. I have one boy, 2-year-old boy, and he's all of that. And I can imagine 3 boys. That's a lot, a lot of fun as well, right? Thank you, Dr. Matthew. So now I ask Ednardo, please, to ask his first question. Edge.
Okay. Hi, Doctor. Good to see you again. So, in your book, Work and Worship, chapter 10, titled Work at the Lord's Table, you mention, quote, before contemporary workers approach the Lord's table, churches can occasionally offer them a moment of vocational examination and confession. So, through this picture, I can see, for example, career and success as identity messing up Christians' life. So I think my first question is, how do you see the doctrine of the priesthood of all saints helping workers to shape and guide their vocational perspectives and examination at the Lord's table?
Yeah, thank you. Well, another part of my story that I didn't tell was when I finished my Bible and seminary education, I served as a pastor in New York City. I think a number of Brazilians know who Tim Keller is. So I worked for Tim Keller in his church there at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. And they had a faith and work ministry. So a ministry specifically to Christian professionals and Christian workers there in the city. And so I was thinking a lot about how should Christians engage in business and the marketplace. And furthermore, we were asking, how can the church serve workers and professionals well? And because we were a Reformed church, we were very strong on a theology of work or a worldview of work. But we were also weak on another point, which is thinking about worship and liturgy and how that connected with our work in the city. And so this particular book that I wrote, that Ednardo, or Edge, is talking about, it looks at how Sunday morning worship can inform our work on Monday morning, because many workers feel this division between their Sunday morning worship and then their Monday morning work. And Protestants, or the Reformed tradition, have always thought of, we don't have just one priest, we are all priests. And so we all do holy work. We all serve the Lord in different callings. So we understand that in our head, but we don't always understand that in our heart. Protestants still put their pastors up on the stage and treat their pastors like they are the priests, and we pay the professional Christians to do those things. So what we tried to think about was, how can worship remind the whole people that all of you are a priesthood? And when it comes to the table, helping them understand that at the Lord's Supper, when we lift up the bread and the wine, or juice if you don't do wine, we are lifting up the work of our hands. So we're not lifting up grapes and grain. We're lifting up bread and wine, which is work. And we're lifting our work up to God. And at the table, God gives us his work back. But it doesn't stop at consumption. The table is our food for life in the world. It's nourishment for work in the world. So what we do at the table has consequences for Monday morning. The Lord's Supper is not a private and personal. Of course, it is personal, but it's also public. So when you experience the hospitality of God at the table, you need to go out on Monday and share that hospitality through your workplace. So part of what we're trying to help Christians understand is the public nature of worship, that worship sends and scatters us into the world of work.
That's very good. Thank you, Doctor. Now, Cynthia, can you ask your first question, please?
First of all, Dr. Matthew, it's an honor to speak to you. And my first question is also related to the Lord's table. As I'm Anglican, I really enjoy your approach in your book, Connecting the Lord's table and work, especially highlighting the table as a space of equality, solidarity, community, and valuing what is ordinary. However, is this a fact that church celebrated and understand the Lord's Supper in very different ways? And many pastors or ministers do not speak about Lord's Supper with applications for workers. So what practical advice would you give so that churches, and with their diversity of traditions, can promote this connection more intentionally?
That's a wonderful question. So I'm writing a very practical book right now for pastors and worship leaders, which provides lots of little ideas for how you can do this. But you are correct. Diverse churches celebrate in diverse ways. And so I think it's best to build on what you already do rather than completely changing how you practice the Lord's Supper. If you radically change it, your people will get very upset. So you want to slowly build and slowly start to ask questions about these kinds of things. The Lord's Supper has so many different meanings and layers to it. So you could talk about the Lord's Supper in 100 different ways, and they would all be correct because there's lots of different things happening at the table. So you can talk about sharing, you can talk about grace, you can talk about hospitality, you can talk about sacrifice, you can talk, there's lots of different places. So every time, my advice would be, every time you celebrate, highlight something different about the table rather than saying the exact same thing. So it's a bit like, in English, we have this word prism, where the light hits the prism and it shows lots of different colors. The Lord's table should function that way. And then finally, always be thinking about, what difference does this table make for how we behave in the world? So pushing it beyond just a private experience with Jesus, but a public experience that purchases me for a way of being in the world.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Tiago, please, can you ask your first question? Yeah, your mic is closed. No, I cannot hear you. Okay, do you need like 5 seconds or no? No. So I think I will ask my question while you figure out your mic, okay? Okay. I myself, I was trained in the Reformed tradition. I made my master's at Calvin Theological Seminary. And also before that, most of the books that I read and the theological influences on my life were from the Reformed tradition. So much of my theological training, the way I see theologically the world, I think was shaped deeply by the Reformed tradition. And also how I understand work and our relation to the work. But I have, I think, an uneasiness with one aspect of how usually Reformed see this relationship between faith and work, and I'd like to hear you about that. So let me quickly try to explain this uneasiness. Usually, all Christian traditions speak how Christians have to serve others in the work or through the work. I think this is kind of universal. But one distinctiveness of the Reformed tradition is that there is a Christian way or a Reformed way to do that job. So what is the Christian perspective of lawyers or for a person working in a bank? There is a Christian way that I have to embody and that distinct our work from the way others do their job, right? And usually this is linked with our work as redeemers of the culture, to have to redeem through our job. Okay, this may work well for a small percentage of the kinds of jobs, but for most of the world population, if we think the kinds of jobs that people are doing, it's strange for me to think that they are like redeeming the culture. They are in terrible jobs with terrible wages, terrible salaries, in terrible conditions. They are just surviving. So in Brazil, half of our workforce work in terrible conditions, and they are not even governed by laws like Uber drivers and other kinds of stuff. They are like surviving. So what the Reformed tradition has to say about this, like, hey, Uber, work harder, transform the culture, driving well and being nice with your clients, is that, or there is something different that we can say from a Christian perspective?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. I love that question. And I'm going to say yes and no. Reformed approaches to work tend to focus on Genesis 1, 2, and 3. My colleague Corey Wilson and I, who wrote the first book, we're now writing a second book in which we are saying, the Bible actually has a lot more to say about work than just Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And we use places. So there is a theology of work for Eden, but there's also a theology of work for Egypt. And working in Egypt under Pharaoh is very different, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to, is when you're working for Pharaoh, you don't have a lot of choices. You can't really redeem Egypt, right? Similarly, when you're in exile, you can't really transform Babylon. You can make some small choices, but you can't do that, you know? So we are building sort of a contextual theology of work for people who find themselves in Eden and Egypt and exile and so forth. So I think you are very right that different workers, God is present to them in a very different way. I also understand your concern about having a Christian view of law and a Christian view of being a dentist and a Christian view of whatever else. Sometimes the obsession with being different and distinct from the world, I think, is a mistake. Nicholas Walterstorff argues that we should not try to be different. He says we should try to be faithful. And sometimes faithfulness will make us very strange in politics or law or whatever else. But other times faithfulness will make us quite a bit like our colleagues. And he says we shouldn't be so concerned with being different or distinct. We should be happy when our Jewish or Muslim or atheist colleagues agree with us. We shouldn't be concerned when that happens. That said, I would like to defend that desire to have a Christian view of dentistry and a Christian view of nursing and so forth, because every single field is shaped by ideologies. Every single field has some kind of assumption about what it means to be human and what is the good life. And you can't just be a dentist, right? You are going to treat your patients in a very specific way. If you think your patients are just there to make you rich, you know, you will treat your patients in a very specific way. If you think your patients are made in the image of God, that they're sacred, that people who, you know, need help with their teeth, and so forth, you know, then that impacts how you approach that. So I think that it's a good thing for Christian dentists to gather and to talk about the challenges and the temptations and the difficulties. I think it's good for them to gather and pray together and encourage each other. But it's not about being different. It's about trying to be faithful in that place. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good. Tiago, are you ready?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, God. So, okay, so I'd like to move away from the topic of faith in work and talk about the theme of hospitality. This is a very fruitful topic in contemporary theology, for example, and it is one of that I personally hold dear. And one of my favorite theologians, which is Miroslav Volf, whom I had the honor to study under the supervision at Yale, uses the term, So he uses the term hermeneutic hospitality, which I loved. And he talks about like how we have this disposition as Christians to understand the truth claims of other religions or worldviews. And in your book about Muslim immigration, this one here, it's really good. I recommend it to everyone. So in this book, you use hospitality as the core or the heart of your theology. And what would you say is the most important way to cultivate hospitality, whether it's to understand the others as this hermeneutic hospitality, or the actually welcoming to the other into our faith communities, to our neighborhoods, to our families? I mean, how do we cultivate these practices and at the same time we make sense of them in our faith or through our faith? I'd like to hear from you.
So you want to know practically, how do we become more hospitable?
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah.
So when you are riding a bicycle, when you are learning to ride a bicycle, you are terrible. You're very bad at it at the beginning, and it's only through practice that you improve. The same is true for practicing hospitality. So the first step is, I think what's interesting is that Jesus in his life is very much a guest with a lot of people. He's not actually a host. So he moves into other people's homes, other people's spaces, other people's boats. Jesus is often a guest. And I think that the first step for many of us is to take the uncomfortable step of going into other people's spaces where we are not in control. So stepping into, if you are in right-wing politics, stepping into a left-wing conversation and asking questions. If you are in left-wing politics, stepping into right-wing conversations and asking questions. So being a good guest means you don't take over, but you are curious. You are saying, what's going on here? So you go into a Muslim space and you are a good guest. You learn to ask questions. You are curious. So I think that one of the ways to begin a life of hospitality is actually to learn how to be a guest first. And then when you have a moment to be hospitable to others, to welcome in other guests, you know and you understand what it feels like to be a guest in a strange place. And you know the discomfort that you have felt. And so you will set the table, you will prepare the table in a way that is sensitive to your guests and is welcoming to them.
Sure, that's a lot to think and to put in practice, actually. That's very, very helpful for our moment internationally. Thank you. Ed, can you ask your second question, please?
Of course. So, Doctor, still talking about your work and worship, chapter 11, worship that gathers workers. You highlighted that a wonderful quote, like, every Sunday, many workers will arrive at church feeling stressed, bored, angry, and heartbreaking about their various callings in the world. So my question is, how do you see the sanctuary's art and architecture helping those workers feel welcome and instigated to communicate their vocational frustrations to God and brothers and sisters, and
Yeah, so I'm going to talk first about terrible mistake that is very common in the United States. If you go to church, evangelical churches in the United States, and you sing worship songs, the words for the song are on a screen. And behind the screen is often pictures of mountains and fields and rivers and the ocean and maybe the stars. Have you ever had this in Brazil, where there's nature for the Okay. So, of course, what this communicates to everyone is that God is to be found in the stars or in the mountains or in sort of grand, beautiful, exotic places. You would never see images of city streets or offices or factories right there during worship. Now, let's go back to the early church. The very first church structure that we have found, it's from the 3rd century. It's in Italy, near Venice. We've found a number of mosaics and artworks on the floor and on the wall to this very early church. And what we have found is images of fishermen bringing their fish into worship, and images of bakers bringing bread, and there's women carrying in their flowers, and fruit, and they're bringing in grapes to donate to the church, and that will be distributed to the poor. And there is this big, beautiful mural of fishermen out in their boats. And there's a picture of, I think it's maybe Jonah and a whale. There's a big sea monster. But this is how they decorated their worship space, because they understood that they could carry their work to the Lord. And they also understood that that God was with them when they were out on the sea and they were working. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is ways in which images in worship can remind us of our daily lives and work. And so I will give you a very practical idea that you can do in your church anytime. So you can have people in your congregation take a picture of themselves at their school or at their workplace, at their factory, at their hospital, but just take a picture where they are. And then they can send that photo to their pastor or their worship leader. And they can collect all those photos. And then have a time of prayer during worship where you just look at the photos of everyone in your congregation and you pray for them, where they will be, Monday morning at 10 in the morning. And this is one way that we can sort of blend Sunday and Monday morning. Instead of escaping to the mountains or escaping to the stars, worship should send us into the city, because God is there in the city. You don't have to run away from the city to find God. You don't have to run to the exotic. God is right there in your boring job.
Thank you. Wow, very good. So, Cynthia, can you ask your second question, please?
My next question is about Monday, too. In the epilogue of your book, Work and Faith, you discuss the challenge that emerge on Monday and emphasize how spiritual practice and worship are crucial for meaningful engagement between our faith and our work. In this context, how can reading, meditating on, and praying through the Psalms can bridge the gap between our daily work and our spirituality?
That's wonderful. Well, one of the things we found in our research was that the book of Psalms is not really about the clouds. It's about the earth. If you read the Psalms, you will find God described as a shepherd, as a farmer. as an engineer and a builder, as someone who irrigates the fields. You will find images of cows and sheep and grain, talk of the marketplace and rich people and poor people. The Psalms are not in the clouds. They are in the fields and the marketplace. They are earthy in very important ways. So the Psalms also give language to the raw experience of workers. So there are laments, and there's anger, there's sadness, there's disappointment in the Psalms. Of course, there's joy as well. But any emotion that a worker might feel, anything a worker might want to say to God, they can find that language in the Psalms. The last thing I'd say is, if you read the Psalms at home in your bedroom, or if you read the Psalms in your church building, they will sound different than if you take them into the city and you read them there. If you take them into your office and you read them there, it actually matters where you do your devotions. And I have often talked with workers and advised them not to do their morning devotions at home, but advise them to do them at work. Not in a, loud way, sort of showing I'm such a good Christian, but actually doing them at work. And some of them actually go to their desk and take their shoes off under their desk to say, this desk, this is holy ground, as a way to remind them of that. So that's another kind of interesting thing they do.
Thank you. Tiago, please, your next question.
Okay, so again, moving away from this topic and talk about other things. So
you want to talk about politics? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah. It's kind of politics. Yeah. Let's do it. So, I'm a big fan of how you and Shetty Hamid run this at the gate. I love this podcast, and if I'm being honest, it's hard to imagine a podcast like this in Brazil, with let's say a pastor and a pai de santo, which is a Afro-Brazilian religious priest, talking about faith, politics, and pluralism, for example. And well, this leads me to ask you about your take on this deep disagreements as you and Shetty talks on the podcast, especially in secular societies like Brazil and the US. And my question will be, to what extent is a Christian duty to engage in conversations with other religions and forms of life, especially about public concerns? What is the final goal? It's agreement. It's kind of like convincing the other.
That's wonderful. I would say there is no final goal when it comes to engaging deep religious or political difference. We as Christians live in the in-between time. We live in the shadowlands. We live in between two cities. And so it is not for us to have a final goal. That is God's. God's calling is to end our religious and political debates. It is not my task to win any debates. It is not even my task to convert anyone. That is the work of God. I can witness to what I have experienced in Jesus, and I can argue for political policies that I think are just, and I will argue for policies that I care about. But my task is not to end the debate or end the disagreement or take over a country or take it back for Jesus. Jesus is not weak. So Jesus does not need me to take back America, and Jesus does not need you to take back Brazil. So you can rest tonight. Jesus is king. Christians are not. So once we accept that, I can talk to a Muslim, or I can talk to a right-wing or a left-wing politician, and I can relax. I can let my shoulders down. I can let my hands open. My teeth don't need to be tight. I don't need to make fists, because Christ is king. And what that means is that I am free to be curious. I am free to be kind. I'm free to be generous. I am also free to take risks. So in a divided political age, people are not willing to take risks for lots of reasons. So we don't reach out. And I think about, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane when they're coming to arrest him. And there's people with spears and swords, and they have torches, and it's dark, and there's fighting. And at that moment, all of the human beings they believe there's only two choices. I either have to fight or I have to run away. I have to flee. Those are the only two options they can imagine. In English, we say to fight or flee. But Jesus does something really strange. He reaches out a hand and he heals the person who came to attack him. He heals the person who came to arrest him. And I believe that if we are in Christ, we are empowered to do something strange. In a political moment of fighting, we are free to reach out an unarmed hand and demonstrate that kind of hospitality and curiosity. That doesn't mean that we accept everything. That doesn't mean that we agree. We can still argue. But it does mean that we disagree with a sort of lighthearted, we disagree with a joy and a sense of freedom, knowing that we don't have to win. And that changes how we engage political differences and religious differences.
Wow. Tiago, I think you'll have a follow-up.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question.
Please.
So, okay. So I'm 100% with you on that. And I think I'm more radical about this because I find myself as more on the left on politics. So I'm more open to this dialogue between religions and everything. So I was just thinking to make the questions. So I was thinking here, I know that we don't have the ultimate hope on politics and in these dialogues about politics with other religions, but we have penultimate hopes that are available to us. We have provisional conclusions to get to with other people, with other faith, with other religions and everything. So how do you see that? And I think, of course, you do that on your podcast, of course, maybe with different outlines. But the thing is, how do you see these provisional goals that we have to have in common with other religions and worldviews that maybe because of our more closed vision about religion or evangelicalism, we don't open room for these conversations?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to answer that question because you're coming from different contexts and so forth. So yes, I would agree that Christians and Muslims and Jews, we all value justice. We value children. We value life. We value education. We value healthy bodies, right? So we can agree on lots of things. That said, every time we get specific, we start to fight. And Shadi Hamid, my Muslim friend, he and I might agree in general, but we are always it will always be provisional, as you said. It will also be temporary. So the alliance won't last forever. And it will be unpredictable. So I would say for those of you on the left, Tiago, those on the left tend to be, in my mind, too optimistic about building bridges across faiths. And so they can also only partner with leftist Muslims and leftist Jews. And so that leaves out more conservative Muslims and more conservative Jews. So what you tend to do is you start to look for partners that agree with you, rather than looking for people you just want to have a conversation. So people on the left tend to look for Muslims that agree with them. And then they say, let's have a dialogue because we all love socialism, or we all love whatever. So this is how people on the left can sometimes be patronizing to conservative religious communities. So I just think that it's much better to allow the differences to occur and to take joy when we agree on something. And allow that disagreement to arise when it happens, and not to get over. Yeah, we should have more conversations about this, Tiago. I hope that helps.
Yeah, well, there's so much that I'm thinking on your answers that I'd like to follow up for life. Like we need to do this in a proper table, in a real meeting, maybe next year in Brazil.
Yes. So I will be coming to Sao Paulo in May, but I'm happy to have more of these conversations, and maybe Tiago and I can just fight for a whole hour sometime, and that'd
be very nice to watch.
I hope so.
Good. So I have a final serious question, because after that I have some funny questions. But my final serious question is also on this political theology stuff, Well, it's hard to specify my question, but I'll try to be quick. The way you put the role of a Christian person in our current political divide, and I tend to agree with you, is as a person who has not their ultimate allegiances to neither side. You can have your preferences, you can have your political things that you think are best, but you cannot have your final allegiances from one side or the other. So you are free to challenge both sides, right? On the other hand, I think that our current political divide is in great part shaped by the Christian involvement. So it's not as much that Christians have to they are addressing a conflict that is not theirs. There are probably one of the major players in this political divide. It's impossible to think US or Brazilian politics without the major role evangelicals and other Christian traditions have been in shaping this political environment and political divide. and I'm sorry, but political craziness that we are living in. So my question is how to think about it, because it seems to me that a reformed theologian would say Christians have to redeem politics. I would answer, well, they have tried to do that and thinks, I'm not sure that they have been done so well. So maybe you have to step aside and be silent for 10 years and then you can come back. So I'd like to hear from you, your perspective on this.
Yes. When Christians try to transform politics, politics often transforms Christians. So that's absolutely true. However, we don't have a choice. We cannot run away. We have to engage in political life. So Christians have to seek justice. We must. It is an important part of loving our neighbor. And I speak as someone, I am an American who is wealthy and safe and comfortable, and I have access to food and water and work. I am free to not be involved in politics because my life is comfortable. But there are many people in my country who need justice. There are many people in my country and around the world who need the United States to have good leaders. Donald Trump is going to impact everyone in the world. And so American Christians have a responsibility to vote and be engaged, even though we make mistakes, even though we do terrible things, even though politics corrupts us. We do not have a choice. So I am very reformed about this. I believe that Christians have a responsibility to pursue justice. We have to be salt. We have to be light. We have to be leaven and yeast. But we need to do so understanding that it is Christ and not Christians who is going to ultimately redeem and restore. So the mistake that I'm hearing in your question is we have to redeem politics. No, we do not have to redeem politics. We have to be faithful. But we are not responsible. You are not responsible for Brazil. Jesus is, right? I am not responsible for America. Jesus is. And I will have to, when I die, I will have to answer for my part.
That's profound, and I hope more Christians think like that. So thank you, Dr. Kaemingk, right? Now we are going toward the end of our conversation. So I used to ask very quick, personal, and maybe funny questions to our interviewers. So my first quick question, Professor, is that were you happy with the Dodgers winning the World Series?
Well, I'm from Seattle, and Seattle has a terrible baseball team. We are awful. I don't know who in Brazil maybe the terrible soccer team is that everyone cries and laughs. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the Mariners. So I learn about Christian suffering through baseball.
Oh, that's very good. Are you like what is the name of the football team from Seattle? It's Seattle This is a good one, right?
Yeah, Seahawks.
Seahawks,
yeah.
I will never forget that Super Bowl when on the last play, they should have give the ball to the running back, which was the best running back in the world. And the quarterback tried to throw, and there was interception. That's what was that?
You are terrible. So
sorry.
Yeah. So here, these are my Seahawks pants.
Oh, you are really fan. I'm sorry to put in this.
Yeah, that was a terrible memory, and you are an awful person. I don't want to talk to you anymore. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry to do this with you. So, do you have? Usually, our interviewers are great theologians or philosophers. So maybe you like to read books that are not academic, not scholarly, not philosophical, not theological. Maybe they are romances, maybe they are poems. Do you have like your favorite romances that you would like, this is the best I've read in my life, or maybe poetry or whatever else that's not connected to your work?
Yeah. So I read for work. So when I need to relax, I don't read. I do woodworking. So I like to build tables and chairs, and I like to do construction. Well, you know, Jesus was a carpenter, so that's what I do. But I will share a book that's a little bit different, that if any of you enjoy cooking and food and good wine and working in the kitchen, there is a book called The Supper of the Lamb. And it is one of my favorite books. It's by an Episcopalian priest, Cynthia, an Anglican priest, who really loved to cook. And he talks all about having parties and cooking and serving wine, and about God's glory and beauty and flavor. And it's all about God's presence in the kitchen. And so his name is Robert Capon, and the book is called The Supper of the Lamb. Also, for your followers in the chat, I just shared a little link to one of my articles. Maybe you can put that in the chat for them to read. So it's related to the political conversation we just had about American evangelicals and how badly they are behaving in political life, to your question, Marcelo, and basically how we can, as evangelicals, behave better in political life. Yes, that's the book. So, anyways, Supper of the Lamb. If you're interested in a theology of kitchens, I highly recommend it. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you. I love cooking, and even more, I like eating good food and drinking good wine. So I'm looking forward to read this book. So thank you very much, Dr. Kaemingk, for your patience, for your hospitality with our questions, for your time. Engaging with our questions. Thank you very much. I'm sure that our audience was blessed and will be blessed by our conversation. Thank you very much.
No, it really was a pleasure. And I will also mention that Ednardo and I are working on a conference in Sao Paulo for Neo-Calvinists, and I know Tiago will be there, and so that's going to be in May. And perhaps, Ednardo, you could share a link to that conference so people can know about that. But I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that we can do this again.
I hope it too. Pessoal, agradeço muito também aos nossos convidados. Obrigado ao Ednardo, a Cynthia e o Tiago pela participação, pelas excelentes perguntas. Obrigado, gente, de coração, viu? E também quero dizer que o professor Matthew acabou de dizer que ano que vem, em maio, o Ed aqui, né, junto com o professor Matthew, estão organizando um evento em São Paulo sobre a tradição neocalvinista, um evento acadêmico no qual você pode tanto participar enviando um trabalho para apresentar lá, como simplesmente indo para assistir, né, as palestras, as conversas. Então, vai ser uma oportunidade única para nós aqui do Brasil de ter uma experiência mais de perto com gente de alto calibre que tem pensado a tradição reformada. E com isso, queridos, nós estamos encerrando mais uma entrevista do nosso Entre Mundus, o canal de entrevistas da revista Unus Mundus da Academia BC2. Foi um grande prazer estar com vocês mais essa vez. Um abração.